The envelope was already sitting at my place when I walked into the restaurant. Not a menu, not a name card, an envelope, thick and cream-colored, with my name written on the front in my mother-in-law's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. That looping cursive she used for Christmas cards and passive-aggressive thank you notes. My husband pulled out my chair like nothing was wrong. My sister-in-law was already on her second glass of wine. My father-in-law was studying the breadbasket like it owed him money. I sat down and didn't touch the envelope. I already knew what was inside. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start at a restaurant. It starts 7 years ago in a hospital parking garage in Columbus, Ohio, at 11:30 at night, when I was sitting in my car eating a granola bar because I hadn't had a real meal in 14 hours and I had another 6-hour shift starting at 6 the next morning. I was 31. I was a hospitalist, a hospital medicine doctor, which means I lived inside the walls of Riverside Methodist and rarely came out. My patients were the ones nobody else wanted to deal with: the complicated admissions, the post-surgical complications, the people who fell through the cracks between their primary care doctor and the specialist who wouldn't see them until February. I loved the work. I was genuinely deeply good at it, and I had absolutely nothing else going on. No apartment I was proud of, no savings account that made me feel safe. I was paying off $290,000 in med school loans, which at my salary would take the better part of a decade, even being aggressive about it. I drove a 2015 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. I ate a lot of granola bars. That was when I met him. He came in as a patient, chest pain, turned out to be stress-related, nothing serious, and he was in the hospital for 2 days, and by the time I discharged him, he had asked me out 3 times, and I had said no twice. The third time I said yes, mostly because I was tired and he made me laugh, and I couldn't remember the last time someone had made me laugh. His name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is his family. His mother, who I will call Mom because that's what she made me call her from the third time we met, was a woman who had built her entire identity around the idea that she had excellent taste in furniture, in wine, in people. She collected things she considered worthy of her and quietly discarded things she didn't. She had decided, somewhere around the 6-month mark of my relationship with her son, that I was the second category. I wasn't sure why at first. I was educated. I was financially stable, or getting there. I was polite in the way that Midwestern women learn to be polite before they learn anything else. But I think the problem was that I was not impressed by her, and she could feel it. She was used to people being impressed by her. Her house was impressive, a 4,800 square foot colonial in Upper Arlington, with a kitchen renovation that had cost more than my annual salary. Her husband had been a commercial real estate developer for 30 years. Her older son, my husband's brother, was a partner at a law firm downtown. And then there was her younger son, who worked in healthcare administration, which is not the same as being a doctor, and who had started dating a woman who was a doctor. And something about that particular configuration seemed to bother her in a way she never quite put into words. What she said instead, in 100 small ways over 4 years of marriage, was, "You are not really one of us." She said it by never remembering how I took my coffee, even though she could recite her other daughter-in-law's, the brother's wife, exact order from memory. She said it by referring to my job as that hospital thing at dinner parties. She said it by asking, every single Thanksgiving, whether I'd thought about switching to dermatology so I could have more of a life. She said it by talking about her grandchildren, her other son's kids, in front of me and my husband for 4 years without ever once acknowledging that we might eventually have some too. She was never cruel enough that I could point to a specific moment and say that. That was the thing that was so hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. She was always just barely on the acceptable side of every line. She was the kind of person who could make you feel like nothing while saying absolutely nothing wrong. My husband saw it, I think, but he didn't want to see it. He was the younger one, the one who'd always tried harder and gotten less credit, and I think some part of him had made a kind of peace with it that I hadn't been informed about before I married him. He would say things like, That's just how she is. Or she loves you, she just shows it differently. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned to look at a certain kind of pain and call it something else. His brother was worse, honestly, though in a more visible way. He found me amusing in the way that people find things amusing when they're also slightly threatened. He was the kind of lawyer who had never once lost an argument at a dinner table, and I was the kind of person who didn't argue. I just stopped listening. He read that as stupidity for about 2 years, and then started reading it as something else, and never quite got comfortable. His wife, my sister-in-law, was fine. She was a former event planner who had married into this family about a year before I did, and she had done something I hadn't. She had decided that the price of admission was worth it. She wore the right brands. She laughed at the right moments. She had produced 2 children in rapid succession and named them things the grandmother approved of. She was not my enemy, she was just someone who had made a different calculation than I had. The dinner that night was framed as a celebration. My father-in-law was turning 65. They'd reserved a private room at a restaurant in Dublin, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a sommelier who knew my mother-in-law by name. I'd driven 40 minutes to get there after a 10-hour shift. I had changed in the hospital bathroom. I sat down and there was the envelope. My mother-in-law smiled when I reached for it. That was the moment I understood this had been choreographed. "We thought it would be nice," she said, "to talk about some things as a family. Get everything organized while everyone is together." I opened the envelope. Inside was a document. Specifically, it was a proposed amendment to my in-laws' living trust. I am a doctor, not an attorney, but I had spent enough time watching my husband's brother talk about contract law at family dinners that I had developed a basic working knowledge of legal documents. I read it twice. The amendment proposed to restructure the distribution of the family estate. Specifically, it proposed to reclassify a property, a commercial building my father-in-law had put into a family trust several years before, which I knew my husband held a 30% interest in, as an asset to be transferred in full to the older son's branch of the family upon my in-laws' passing. In exchange, my husband and I would receive what was described as a fair market adjustment in cash, which, based on the valuation figure listed in the document, amounted to roughly 40 cents on the dollar. The stated reason, outlined in a short paragraph that I recognized as having been drafted very carefully, was that my brother-in-law's family had a greater ongoing operational relationship with the property and that consolidation of ownership would preserve the asset's long-term value for the benefit of the Whitfield family. There was a signature line at the bottom for my husband and, beneath his, one for me. I set the document down on the tablecloth. "I'd like a few minutes," I said. My mother-in-law said, "Of course, we'll order drinks first." My husband was reading his copy. I could see from the way his jaw was set that this was not entirely new information to him, and that specific realization that there had been conversations he hadn't told me about settled somewhere in my chest like a stone. My brother-in-law was doing that thing he did where he was pretending not to watch me. His wife was looking at the menu. My father-in-law, to his credit, seemed slightly uncomfortable. He was a man who had spent his career in real estate, which meant he understood numbers and documents and the weight of what he was asking. He wasn't a cruel person. He had simply, over the course of his life, made the mistake of letting other people decide what was fair. "I have a question," I said. "Of course," my mother-in-law said. She had the warm, patient voice of someone who had already decided how this evening would end. "This valuation." I pointed to the figure in the document. "Where did it come from?" My brother-in-law cleared his throat. "We had the property assessed." "By whom?" A pause. "An independent appraiser." "Can I see the appraisal?" The pause was longer this time. "We didn't bring it tonight." I nodded slowly. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. Outside the private room, I could hear the faint sound of the restaurant, silverware, other conversations, the low note of a piano somewhere. "Here's my concern," I said. "I know that property. I've driven past it probably 200 times. I know what's on that block. I know what sold on that block in the last 3 years, And I know what the cap rate should be on a building that size in that submarket. And what I'm looking at right now, I tapped the document, does not reflect the market. My mother-in-law's smile hadn't moved. Real estate can be complex. It really can be, I agreed. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, because I had not told a single person in this family, was that 9 months earlier I had sold a company. Not a hospital, not a practice, a company. 4 years before that dinner, around the time I was eating granola bars in parking garages and trying to figure out if I was going to spend my entire life inside a hospital, I had started paying attention to a problem nobody in medicine seemed to want to solve. Hospitalists like me were burning out at catastrophic rates. The documentation burden was unsustainable. I was spending nearly 3 hours a day on notes and orders that had nothing to do with actually treating patients. I had an idea for a software platform that could change that, something that integrated with existing EHR systems but used a different workflow logic than anything on the market. I didn't know how to build software. I found someone who did. I gave up every weekend for a year and a half. I went to bed at 10 and woke up at 4 and worked on the problem until I had to be at the hospital. My husband knew I was working on something. He knew it involved technology and healthcare. He did not know the specifics because I had learned early in our marriage that discussing my work ambitions in the presence of his family led to conversations I didn't want to have. The first version launched quietly, then it didn't stay quiet. By the time we closed the sale, and I'm still getting used to typing this, still feel something lurch in my stomach when I say it out loud, the company had been acquired for $220 million. I owned a 60% equity stake after the seed round. The wire transfer hit my account on a Thursday morning in June. I was rounding on patience when my phone buzzed. I excused myself, walked into a supply closet, read the notification, and stood very still for about 90 seconds. Then I walked back out and finished rounds. I hadn't bought anything. I hadn't moved. I was still driving the Civic, still working the same shifts, still eating from the hospital cafeteria more often than was good for me. The money was in accounts that were held in my name alone, organized through an LLC and a trust that my own attorney, not my in-laws' family attorney, my own, one I had hired and paid for myself, had structured carefully. No one in my husband's family had any connection to any of it. I had intended to tell my husband first. I had been working up to it, trying to find the right moment, trying to figure out how to say our entire financial reality has changed without also saying I have been carrying this alone because I didn't trust your family not to change how they treated me if they knew. That conversation had not happened yet. Then came the dinner. Then came the envelope. And I understood, sitting there with the document in front of me, that the timing of this conversation was not accidental. Someone had found out something. Maybe not the full picture, but enough. Maybe someone at the hospital had mentioned it. Maybe there had been some paperwork visible that shouldn't have been. Or maybe this had simply been planned for months and I happened to have a significant financial resource they didn't know about. Either way, they were asking me to sign away my husband's 30% interest in a commercial property for 60 cents less than it was worth. And they were doing it at a birthday dinner with a sommelier nearby in white tablecloths and the implicit social pressure of the whole family watching. I folded the document back into the envelope. "I'm not going to sign this tonight," I said. My mother-in-law set down her wine glass with a small, precise motion. "We're not asking you to sign it tonight. We just wanted to discuss." "I understand. But I want to be clear. I'm not going to sign this, period, without independent legal review. And based on what I've read in the last 10 minutes, I have significant concerns about the valuation." "You don't have a background in real estate," my brother-in-law said. It was said pleasantly. He was very good at saying things pleasantly. "No," I said. "But I have a background in reading documents carefully, and what this says is that you want to purchase my husband's share of a property for about 40% below fair market value and call it equitable." The table was quiet. My father-in-law looked at the tablecloth. My sister-in-law refilled her wine. My husband said very quietly, "Maybe we should." "I have one question for the table," I said. I looked at my mother-in-law directly. Did you know that two of the comparable properties on that block sold in the last 18 months, and what they sold for? She said nothing. I'm guessing no, I said. I'm guessing whoever did this valuation either didn't know or didn't include that information, because if they had, the number on that page would be about 60% higher. We didn't have a dramatic scene. I want to be clear about that because I know that's what people expect from a story like this. Raised voices, tears, someone throwing a napkin and storming out. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, harder. My mother-in-law smiled and said she thought we should all take some time to consider things. My brother-in-law said he'd forward the appraisal when he found it. My father-in-law ordered a steak. My husband and I drove home in separate cars because I had driven myself, and when we got back to the house, he sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I didn't know they were going to bring the documents tonight." I believed him about that. I believed him about only that. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "A few weeks." "Were you going to tell me?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I had my answer. I want to be fair to him, because the truth is that this story is not really about him. He was not malicious. He was not greedy. He was a man who had spent his whole life trying to please a family that was very good at making people feel that the easiest path was also the right one. When his mother had presented this plan to him, he had probably told himself that there would be time to discuss it, that things would work out, that I didn't need to be worried about it. He was wrong about all of that. But he was not evil. Over the next 3 weeks, I had my attorney request a full independent appraisal. The number came in 58% higher than the figure in the family's document. I forwarded it to my mother-in-law's email without comment. The response was a phone call in which she told me that I was making a simple family matter unnecessarily complicated, that I had never really tried to be part of the family, and that perhaps this was an opportunity to reflect on what the word family actually meant. I listened to the whole thing. When she was finished, I said, "I'll have my attorney reach out to coordinate next steps." She hung up. What happened after that took about 4 months and involved more paperwork than I have ever seen outside of a hospital credentialing process. My husband ultimately sided with me on the property dispute. I think the independent appraisal made it impossible for him to do anything else without confronting what his family had attempted. His brother was furious. His mother did not speak to me directly for 11 weeks. The property interest was retained at full value. But the more significant conversation between my husband and me about everything I hadn't told him was harder. I told him about the company. I told him about the sale. I showed him the documentation. I watched his face go through about 6 different things in the span of 2 minutes, and none of them were simple. What I told him was the truth. I had not hidden it out of deception. I had hidden it out of self-protection. I had spent 4 years watching his family decide what I was worth based on information they had chosen to collect about me, and I had not been willing to add another data point to their assessment until I understood what they would do with it. "You didn't trust me," he said. "I didn't trust them," I said. "I'm sorry that those became the same thing." That conversation, and the ones that came after it, are not for this story. What I will say is that we are still married. What I will say is that things are different now. What I will say is that different doesn't always mean worse. What I think about now, more than the money or the document or the dinner, is the moment I walked into that restaurant and saw the envelope at my place. I had a choice in that moment. I could have been afraid of it. And I was, a little, for about 30 seconds. I could have deferred, smiled, taken it home to look at later, let the social pressure of a birthday dinner do its work. That is what they had counted on. That is the entire architecture of that kind of manipulation. You put the document in a beautiful room, you surround it with family and candles and the implicit weight of belonging, and you make it feel like the easiest thing to do is to just sign your name and go home. But I had read a lot of documents in my life. I had made a habit of reading the fine print not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the people who love you are not always the same as the people who will protect your interests. Sometimes those are the same person, sometimes they are not. Knowing the difference is not cynicism, it is just paying attention. The envelope was sitting at my place when I walked in. I sat down, I opened it, I read every word, and then I asked the right questions because that is the only thing that has ever actually saved me. Not the money, not the degree, not any of the external things that people assume are armor. Just the habit of reading carefully and refusing to sign anything I didn't understand. I hope, if you're the person in your family who gets handed something at a dinner and told to just trust it, that you open it, read all of it, ask every question you have. And if someone tells you that asking questions means you're not being a team player, well, consider the possibility that you might be playing for the wrong team. I still think about that granola bar. The one I was eating in a parking garage at 11:30 at night alone in my car, with $290,000 of debt and a shift starting in 6 hours. If you had told me then what that night would eventually lead to, the company, the sale, the envelope at the restaurant, all of it, I don't think I would have believed you. Not because I didn't believe in myself. I did, quietly, in the way that people believe in things they can't yet prove, but because I understood, even then, that believing in yourself isn't the same as being believed in. Those are two entirely different experiences, and confusing them is how a lot of people get hurt. What I learned from all of this, not in a clean, quotable way, but in the messy, lived in way that only comes from actually going through something, is that there are three things that either save you or fail you when the pressure gets real. The first is knowing what's right and holding on to it even when everyone around you is making right feel inconvenient. My mother-in-law was not a villain. She was a person who had decided over many years that protecting her family's interests was the same as doing what was good. Those two things are not the same. They can look identical for a long time, and then one evening, someone puts a document in front of you and you can see very clearly exactly where those two paths diverged. I had read enough of those documents to know the difference. More importantly, I had been honest with myself about what I was looking at. Even when being honest was uncomfortable, even when it meant acknowledging that my husband had known and said nothing. Integrity isn't about being perfect, it's about being willing to see clearly when you'd rather not. The second is thinking carefully when everyone around you is hoping you won't. The whole architecture of that dinner, the white tablecloths, the birthday framing, the sommelier, the family watching, was designed to make careful thinking feel like rudeness. That is not an accident. People who want you to make fast decisions in their favor are not doing it because fast decisions are usually better. They are doing it because slow decisions, careful decisions, decisions made with independent counsel and your own appraisal and your own attorney, tend to come out differently. I had built a company by paying attention to problems other people had decided weren't worth solving. That same habit, read it twice, ask the question, don't sign what you don't understand, was what kept me from losing something that was mine. The third is simply not stopping. The loans didn't stop me. The shifts didn't stop me. 4 years of being treated like a footnote in someone else's family story didn't stop me. Not because I was exceptional. I wasn't, not at first. But because I had decided somewhere along the way that I was going to keep going until I had built something that was genuinely, unambiguously mine. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a woman eating a granola bar alone in a parking garage at midnight, but it compounds, quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. The envelope was sitting at my place when I walked in. I sat down, and I opened it, and I read every word. That's all I did. That's all it took. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be in a hurry when someone needs you to be.